When God Sends the Ride. Learning that you can when mistakes say you can't. Written by Michael Baker. Read for you by Jerry Dugan. Copyright 2022 by Michael Baker. All rights reserved. This book is dedicated to my mother, who did her very best in an impossible situation, and to evangelist Wayne J. Barquette, Principal Gerald Wass, and my Uncle Lee, for taking a chance on a troubled kid, and who endured the hardships I often presented them. Special thanks to my loving wife, Marta, who has been supportive of this book and has helped me stay focused and encouraged throughout the process of writing it. Michael Baker. Introduction. This book is a great tool for parents, teachers, and students, whereby they may be individually blessed and thus be able to pass along such blessing to enable others to press forward in their faith. The author, Michael Baker, has written his personal testimony in such a dynamic manner with his hidden agenda of don't give up. I would recommend that this testimony be sent to and distributed to churches, Christian schools, rehabs, and special homes for young people. Some may suggest that if someone is really saved, certain rash behavior will not manifest itself in their life. However, one only has to search the scriptures to refute such an opinion. Abraham's nephew, Lot, was stated by Peter to be a righteous and just man. Tell me one spiritual thing he did for the Lord and not for himself. David was a man after God's own heart, but for one period of time, he surrendered to the flesh and became an adulterer, murderer, liar, and deceiver. Don't forget Samson, who was a special vessel of God from his mother's womb. But one negative incident produced a life of vengeance and worldliness. I believe there are countless young Christians today who need to be prompted and encouraged to keep moving forward in their faith, regardless of how many wrong turns they have made. The author's personal testimony could be just what that waiting and desperate Christian needs to not give up. In his service, Evangelist W. J. Barquette. Chapter 1. What just happened? I stood outside the jail, contemplating what had just happened to me and how I even got there. My everything felt broken, and I remember it being very cold. January in Anderson, Indiana can bring sub-zero temperatures, and all I had on was a very thin windbreaker that my cellmate had given me from his property box. Over the years, and even now when he comes to mind, I ask God to give him special blessing for that act of kindness. I had nothing of my own at the time to keep the brutal cold off me. My arrest and journey to that facility began in the warm, dry air of Austin, Texas, and sadly, I don't even remember my cellmate's name. I like to say that my first thoughts when I was released were about my newfound freedom, but in all honesty, the only thing I could think of at the time was that I had an uncontrollable craving for a McDonald's double cheeseburger. Was jailhouse food that bad, you might ask? All I'll say is there were days when the toilet ate more off my tray than I did. Enough said. There are only a handful of people who know my story at the time of this writing. Until recently, God gave me very specific instructions to sit down and shut up. I know that sounds a bit harsh, and I was tempted to use the phrase, be quiet, but understand me when I say that some hardheads like myself need things expressed in harshness so that we understand the gravity of the moment. I'd also love to say that my brokenness at the time cured me of my rebellious nature. But when one gains the feeling that their quality of life is over, hopelessness sets in, followed by stupidity. Hence the reason God told me to sit down and shut up. I wish that I could just project memories of my journey to each page because there is so much to communicate, but for now, I am limited to the written word. I'm not sure that I could even speak the words and cover all the lessons learned from my journey and the hands-on experience it gave me. Christopher Pierce Cranch once penned, "Thought is deeper than all speech, feeling deeper than all thought. Souls to souls can never teach what unto themselves was taught." Escaping the darkness is not an easy path to follow, and, in my humble opinion, it's not a path that one can survive alone. Had it not been for the individuals that God put in my path along the way, I would not have made it out myself. I heard someone say once that experience is the best teacher, but experience has a way of teaching you things you really didn't want to know. The reality is, I've been to hell and back so many times on this journey, I've been asked to sign on as a permanent tour guide. Before I begin the backstory that might make sense of any of this, I want to give you 2 words that someone wrote in my Bible long before I fell into the darkness. 2 words that God reminded me of at critical times after my release to keep me moving forward. 2 words that will be among many that I share, but 2 words I never want you to forget. You can. Chapter 2. Normal beginnings. Sort of. Life for me began on Forbes Air Force Base in Topeka, Kansas. And from what I can remember, we were a normal military family. At least, it seemed normal to me. Nothing in the early days stands out except that Dad seemed to be away quite a bit because of his military duties. Timelines are a bit skewed for me during this time because by the time I was 10 years old, we had lived in over a dozen states and as many cities. I have memories of living in cities as far west as California to as far east as Tennessee. Memories of mountaintops that rose above our backyard fence in Montana to the hustle and bustle of the big city life in Dallas, Texas. My parents came from opposite sides of the country and very different cultures. My dad was raised in New Mexico by a father who worked in the salt mines, while my mother was raised in Arkansas by a single mother of 9 working in the cotton fields. Their only commonality was that both came from nothing. Even their church backgrounds were different. Dad was raised in an Episcopal church, while Mom was raised in a Baptist church. Dad had dark skin with a grandmother who was a full-blood Indian, and Mom was a fair-skinned redhead. Outside of the constant relocations I experienced due to the military's movement of my dad, life seemed rather normal for a while. Moving so much in my young life would be a two-edged sword. Living in multiple states and multiple cities exposed me to numerous cultural differences across the country. But it would also wreak havoc on my ability to make close friends. Knowing that I would only average about 6 months in any one place made getting close to anyone very difficult. But it would also teach me how to quickly adapt to any surroundings. Chapter 3. When life began to change. It was Dad's deployment overseas that would begin to change my life. To this day, it's a bit of a mystery as to what my dad was doing in Turkey at the time, but Mom would later tell me that he nearly lost the opportunity. She said that during the military security vetting process, he was unable to account for 2 weeks out of his life. It was not a deployment that allowed the family to go as well. That, along with the security process he went through, would suggest a certain level of importance to the mission. Whatever the mission was, the stress of it all led to his heavy drinking and abusive tendencies when he returned. During my dad's time in Turkey, my mother and sister and I would live with my grandmother. Dovey was her name, and having raised 9 kids by herself, she was a tough woman. Not tough in an unkind way, but tough when it came to discipline. I can recount when I was sent outside to cut a switch off a tree. That switch would then be used by my grandmother as a very effective means of letting me know the consequences of misbehavior. For those of you who don't know what a switch is, It's the very thin outer edge of a branch from a tree that was cut off and used to spank with. Though deceptively small, it yielded a sting on one's rear end that was not soon forgotten. Dovey was a devout Christian who never missed a Sunday service at church. She never learned to drive and walked or took a bus everywhere she needed to go. At the time, I had no understanding of church other than the inconvenience of having to dress up as well as the opportunity to take a nap during the service. However, should I act up in church and get the look during the service, it would immediately be followed by a painful pinch from my mother and an opportunity to cut another switch when I got home. I adored my grandmother, who lived to be 93 years old. Even as an adult, I would visit and spend time with her alone. She would outlive my mother by a year and leave me with a phrase that would stay with me as an adult. Though said with a smile when she said it, "I'll rip off your leg and beat you with the bloody end." It let me know she was in charge growing up. Dovey was never sick that I can remember, and the way she died let everyone know just how close she was to her Heavenly Father. In her home, during a family reunion, she announced that she was going to lean back on the couch and take a nap. She laid her head back on the couch, went to sleep, and somewhere within that short nap, God called her home. Her journey in life was over. She never aggressively spread her faith as some would insist, and yet her impact on the lives of others is undeniable. My dad's military service would soon be over. His mission in Turkey and one more mystery mission in Alaska would bring his military service to an end. Even though my dad would soon become overcome by liquor, I was very close to my dad. As close as I was to my dad, the trouble within the marriage turned abusive. One of my first memories of his abuse was when he came home so angry and drunk that he dragged my mom into the house, took off his belt, and whipped her like a child. When I was 10, my dad came home one night after drinking and began to beat my mother. My sister and I were upstairs and awakened by the commotion. We could hear him breaking and throwing furniture in the apartment. We could hear him and my mother tussling with each other as well. At one point, the glass from a hanging lamp he broke had severely cut his hands, and he walked through the apartment, smearing blood all over the walls. When we heard him making his way upstairs, my sister and I buried our heads under the covers and pretended to be asleep. I heard my sister sigh in relief when I was the one he yanked out of bed. I remember the sheer panic I felt. Dragging me by the collar of my pajama shirt, he dragged me down the stairs and pushed me onto the couch. He turned and told Mom that he thought I should see this. He then continued to beat my mother, breaking a couple of her ribs in the process as I watched in horror. It never crossed my mind at the time as to why the neighbors in the adjoining apartments did not call the police. They had to have heard it. But times were different then. Domestic violence was considered none of your business as neighbors, and keeping such things within the immediate family was considered sacred. When each incident was over, we never spoke of it again as a family. Relatives who knew of it never brought it up, ever. There is no worse feeling in life than to watch something like this on a regular basis and be powerless to stop it. I had seen my dad drunk on many occasions. He'd taken me with him to corporate parties and pool halls several times, and I feared my dad when he was drunk. He could be unusually cruel when drunk or when he was enraged. I learned that keeping my mouth shut when he was angry or drunk was the safest way to survive. One of the events that affects me to this very day was the time he stood behind me at dinner and struck me on the head over and over to force me to eat my coleslaw. I won't eat coleslaw to this day, and this may explain why I don't respond well when someone tries to force me to do anything. What made events like those I've described so confusing was when he was sober. He was like a best friend to me. He taught me how to shoot a rifle and hunt when I was 7, and taught me how to fish at an even earlier age. He taught me how to throw and catch a baseball, and would spend hours helping me learn the game. He taught me how to play football, and helped me develop the necessary skills to be competitive. He made sure that I was exposed to the wonders of this country when we traveled, and encouraged me to read at a young age, which eventually landed me in advanced reading classes at school. None of my family could understand why I held my dad in such high esteem after all he'd done over the years, especially after what he was about to do. What he was about to do was abandon us. Chapter 4. Abandoned, but not alone. Shortly before my 13th birthday, my dad left on what I was told was a business trip, never came home, and left us stranded with no money and no transportation. My mother had not worked for over a decade, so it wasn't long before the power and water were cut off. I was tasked to remove all the spoiled food from the refrigerator and sent into the woods to bury it. What made it worse was that just prior to this, my dad and I had been hunting razorback and had just filled a freezer full of hog meat. A freezer full of hog meat that was now spoiled and producing a stench so putrid that the smell still lingers in my nostrils' memory as if it were yesterday. I spent much of my time over the next few weeks approaching the neighbors for food and water, and we lived by candlelight at night as best we could. There seemed to be no apparent escape from becoming homeless soon, but I would soon learn that there was a blessing in it. In fact, there is a blessing in every hardship if one is willing to patiently endure it long enough for the blessing to be revealed. I began to think about God and heaven around this time. Maybe it was because I was feeling helpless, but I became curious. Ironically, it was the story of creation that captured my attention. Other than Noah's Ark, the creation story was the only Bible story I knew, and it was in direct contradiction to evolution. Even at the age of 12, I knew that only one version of how things began could be true. I found an old Episcopal prayer book that my dad had left behind, and began using it to pray with. My thinking was that saying prayers would lead me to God and get me to this heaven place. It didn't last long because reading prayers that were written in a book seemed rather empty to me. I was rather bored with it, to be honest. But when our neighbor invited me to church, my interest piqued again. I went to several services, but there is only one I remember. At the end of that service, we were told to bow our heads and close our eyes. The pastor then asked the congregation to raise their hand if they knew they were saved and going to heaven. Well, I wasn't about to be singled out as an oddball, so I peeked around and raised my hand at the appropriate moment to falsely indicate that I was one of those saved who were heaven-bound. Truth is, I didn't have a clue about what they were talking about. All I knew was that I was empty inside and had just lied to dodge the embarrassment of being called out publicly. I'd heard this word, saved, once before from my cousin. We'd often visited them when I was younger, and as young people do, we behaved in ways we shouldn't have. However, on my last visit, when I suggested to my cousin that we continue with the fun, she stopped me dead in my tracks and stated unapologetically that she no longer did those things because she had gotten saved. I didn't understand it then, and I didn't understand it when I heard it again in this church, but it certainly made its impression. This wasn't the first time I'd been in church, mind you, but it was the first time something began to work in me that I didn't understand. Before you make the mistake of believing I was some sweet, innocent child who never did wrong until this point in my life, let me correct your thinking a bit. Somewhere in the middle of this life of emotional chaos, and before my dad left, I began stealing from the neighborhood store. I would guess my age at about 7. Not much at first, just candy. Then I figured out that if I cut a hole in the pocket of my jacket, I could walk by the candy rack, slide my hand through the hole and grab handfuls of candy instead of just one piece, all without being seen or suspected. It wasn't long before I transitioned into stealing toys that my parents didn't want me to have. I began smoking at the age of 9 by stealing my dad's pipe tobacco and making my own cigarettes. When I got bored with that, I began stealing a pack or two of cigarettes from the neighborhood store, just like I had with the candy. This was an era when cigarettes were out in the open in front of the counter instead of behind them. Little by little, I graduated to stealing a carton of cigarettes by sliding it down my pant leg and walking right past the cashier and manager. Eventually, I was stealing 2 cartons of cigarettes at a time using the same pant leg method. Somewhere around the age of 10, I found myself interested in girls and became overwhelmed by the boy sees girl, boy likes girl, boy wants the girlfriend feeling. My sister was the Cupid who introduced me to Leanne, and it wasn't long before I gave her my bracelet to signify that we were going steady. It was an innocent puppy love that ended at the end of the school year. The breakup could have been the result of our age or the fact that she was my sister's best friend. But, as I recall, it was because she was a bit big for her age, and I didn't think she was pretty enough. I find it ironic that I had been exposed to pornography just prior to this by a friend who'd lifted some of his dad's Playboy magazines. I'd also discovered additional pornography in the woods on our property. I assume it belonged to the previous owner. The availability of pornography may not seem strange in today's world, but this was the 60s and very early 70s. To get caught with this by my parents would more than likely have caused them to ship me off to some home for troubled kids. That is, if I survived the beating I'd get for having it in my possession. Even at this age, pornography was impacting my perception of women and would greatly influence my sexual behavior in the future. What began as just kid fun was becoming an addiction which would soon rule my thoughts. By the time my dad left, I was viewing pornography on a regular basis. I assume I was trying desperately to fill an emotional void that no longer existed in my home. I wanted to escape and feel anything other than fear, hurt, and depression, if only for a moment. I became withdrawn and introverted as a result. The emotional escape that I thought I was achieving would soon become my prison and produced even more emotional turmoil, depression, and hurt. You are not alone if you've taken this path as well, whether it's drugs, alcohol, theft, violence, sex, or the like. It yields the same results. I became trapped in its vicious cycle of behavior that would destroy my self-esteem, bring unbearable guilt, and make it nearly impossible to have healthy relationships of any kind. I was broken inside, but became very good at pretending to be normal. I would soon compensate and justify it all by convincing myself that I was just a loner. Sound familiar? As confused as I was, God would soon bring people into my life to redirect my path. I was an emotional and spiritual train wreck at this point, and had it not been for God's intervention, there's no telling where all this behavior would have led. Chapter 5. When Life Gives You Lemons. It was getting close to my 13th birthday, and it would pass by without the usual celebration. Despite it all, my mother had a plan. We had no money, so buying a gift was out of the question. I don't remember being very concerned with it all. I knew the state we were in and had resolved within myself to do without. I'd grown up with exceptional Christmases and birthdays, so I knew that if she had the money this particular year, would have been no exception. For as long as I can remember, my mother and grandmother had collected S&H green stamps from the grocery store when they bought groceries. The S&H stamps were given out by stores as a reward to loyal customers, and were designed to keep them coming back. The stamps were made just like postage stamps and required you to lick and paste them in a small booklet that was provided by the store at no cost. Each page of the booklet had outlines where the stamps should be placed. Unlike today's 3-foot-long register receipts that have coupons for grocery products and brands you will never buy. These green stamps had actual value. Participating stores had physical merchandise like dishes and silverware you could purchase when you had collected enough stamps to do so. You could also take your stamps to the S&H Green Stamp store and purchase things from a much broader selection. Off we went to the Green Stamp store. My mother revealed how many stamps she had and told me to pick out anything I wanted within the stamp budget. I chose a camping backpack that had a metal support frame and a hatchet that had a beautiful multi-wood handle and leather sheath. Under normal circumstances, my choice of the hatchet would have been immediately rejected. But today was different. Our whole world was now different. Did I choose the hatchet to test the waters? I will neither confirm nor deny. Recently, I found an S&H Green Stamp booklet and stamps on eBay and immediately purchased them. It didn't cost me much, but I would have paid anything to get them. They've been discontinued for decades, but the day she graciously gave up her stamp so that I could have somewhat of a birthday will always hold a very special place in my memory. That day in the Green Stamp store would be one of the few times we would connect emotionally as mother and son for decades. Though financial circumstances would take a turn for the better, our relationship would not. Our drifting apart emotionally was no one's fault. She was in survival mode, and I'm sure her mind was reeling with thoughts of what to do. This was not an era where single moms were put on a pedestal as they are now, and I can attest that it was no party for the son of a single mom either. None of her family of 8 brothers and sisters had divorced, nor ever did. And I knew of no one at the time being raised by a single mom. Mom had to learn to do things on her own, and my survival depended on the ability to become independent as well. Sadly, when you put 2 people learning to be independent in the same room, conflict is unavoidable. Mix that with the raging hormones of a teenager, and it's not a matter of if they will come to blows. It's a matter of when and how hard. Chapter 6. Rescued and Saved. The 6-hour ride to Rogersville, Missouri was uneventful. I'm guessing that I slept through most of it because the only thing I remember from that day is loading what belongings we could into my uncle's car. My uncle drove Buicks for as long as I can remember back then, and in those days, a full-size sedan was considerably larger than current models. There was a full bench seat in the front and had another in the back. The typical arguments that occurred in his car were usually over who had to sit in the middle of the back seat and endure that unforgiving transmission hump on the floor. I'm not exactly sure how much we could fit in his car, but the gangster trunk in those older cars could hold quite a bit. The uncle who came to get us was my mother's brother-in-law, and though I knew nothing of the conversations that must have occurred between Mom and my aunt to get him there, my aunt and uncle's act of kindness came just in time. To my surprise, we would be spending the next several months living with them until my mother could get on her feet. To describe my aunt and uncle as devout Christians would be an understatement, because I would soon be expected to attend every church service. By that, I mean every Sunday school service, every Sunday morning main service, every Sunday evening service, every Wednesday evening service, and every youth group event that was on the church calendar. An attempt was made to keep our accommodations in their home simple, and yet it required sacrifice from their whole family. My mother and sister would sleep on my cousin's bed, and I would sleep on the floor next to the bed. My cousin would move out of her room and share a room with her younger sister. I don't know if you've ever had to share a room with a younger sibling as a teenager, but I assure you, It was not a pleasant experience for the elder sibling. My younger cousin was probably not thrilled about sharing her room either. By the way, this was the same cousin who had slapped me with "I got saved" on our previous visit. It's hard to describe how crushed I was without my dad. My uncle did his best to fill in, but I felt very alone at the time. I began taking long walks on the old country road that ran in front of their house to clear my head, and sometimes cry without anyone seeing me. As emotionally drained as I had become, my cousin and I would become very close over the next few months. Years later, I would end up in other parts of the country, but we've always had a special connection. For whatever reason, I've always felt I was safe to be open with her and talk about what I was feeling. She would often join me on those walks, and we would talk about my situation and what this saved thing was all about. It took a few walks for me to build up the courage, but one day, on one of our walks, I looked at her and said, "I think I want to be saved." The next church service was a Wednesday night service, which had just happened to fall on October 31st. The fact that it was a Halloween night made it impossible to forget the date in the future. I don't remember the message from that night primarily because I was feeling a bit anxious about what was about to happen at the end of the service. My heart was pounding, and as soon as the invitation to come forward was made, I burst into tears. I knew I was broken, and I knew that I was coming down that aisle to give my brokenness to Jesus. Bob Baker was at the altar that night, an easy name to remember because we shared the same last name. As we knelt at the altar together, he opened his Bible to Romans chapter 3 and verse 23, which reads, "For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God." He then turned to Romans chapter 6 and verse 23, which reads, "The wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord." He went on to explain that Jesus had died in our place to provide salvation to a lost world, and turned to Romans chapter 10, verses 9 and 10, which reads, "That if thou shalt confess with thy mouth the Lord Jesus, and shalt believe in thine heart that God hath raised him from the dead, thou shalt be saved. For with the heart man believeth unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made unto salvation." I would need to ask my cousin to show me those verses again later, but at that moment, I bowed my head, confessed myself as a sinner, and asked Jesus to save me. As I raised my head, Bob asked me two very important questions, followed by a statement that would solidify my faith, and I would never doubt from that moment on that I was saved. He asked, "Michael, are you saved?" To which my response was yes. He then asked a question that I wasn't sure how to answer. He asked, "How do you know?" After a brief pause, my response was, "Because I feel it." He then said, "That's good. But you are saved because God's Word says you are." In the future, I would always know that regardless of what was going on in my life, I am saved because God says I am. Chapter 7. Spiritual Insight versus Emotional Trauma. I knew almost immediately after my conversion that God was doing something special in me. I began reading the Bible with a newly found understanding, and a year later, I would come forward again during an invitation at a youth camp in Colorado. Sensing that the Holy Spirit was encouraging me to preach, I came forward and publicly committed to what I perceived full-time ministry to be. I had no idea what that would require, or even if it was within me to do so. I just knew that God was working within me. My youth pastors at the time believed in developing young men for ministry as soon as we felt God's calling. They called us preacher boys. And though I was just 14 at the time, The youth pastors made sure I had an opportunity to preach as soon as we returned from youth camp. There were only 2 of us who had surrendered to preach that year at camp, and we were both instructed to prepare a 10 to 15-minute message to be preached to the youth group on the following Sunday. I won't lie, I was petrified and was wondering what I'd gotten myself into. I had been in a school play once when I was very young, but was on stage for less than a minute and was not required to utter a word. That was the extent of my experience in front of an audience to that point. For most of my life, I've never been very good at remembering names, but I certainly remember the name of that other preacher boy. Ron was his name, and he was first up that Sunday morning. He delivered the most passionate message I'd ever heard from a preacher boy, and it was filled with heartfelt tears. I knew immediately I was in trouble. There was no way I was going to be able to follow that with any emotion other than sheer panic, and I was right. When I was introduced as the next speaker, everything imaginable that could go wrong did go wrong. My hands trembled and my voice cracked as I tried to teach what was on my heart as best I could. At one point, I dropped all the pages of my notes and clumsily gathered them up from the floor while trying to find my place in the message at the same time. When I was done, I walked back to my seat in total defeat, wondering why God would call someone like me to be a preacher. Everyone knew that I was extremely introverted and had no social skills whatsoever. At that moment, I questioned God's wisdom, and yet, when Sunday school was over, several young people approached me and said they appreciated what I'd just taught. At the time, I thought they were just trying to be nice. But I would learn through the years that God chooses guys like me because we are weak, and as Scripture would later teach me, His strength is made perfect in weakness. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9. Over the next year, I would begin to memorize Scripture a little at a time. One of the first verses I memorized spoke to me as one who was being raised by a single mom. It says, "A father of the fatherless and a judge of widows is God in His holy habitation." Psalm chapter 68, verse 5. That would be a verse I would constantly remind myself of when the loneliness of not having my dad set in. God was my father. Memorizing Scripture became a major part of my life, though, to be honest, I've never been a very good student. I've never been officially diagnosed, but it has always been quite noticeable that I've had issues staying mentally focused. As hard as I tried, I couldn't learn like most kids my age. Even as an adult in business, I had to develop unique ways to learn in order to be competitive in the workplace. I would come to call this learning method chasing rabbits. Maybe that will be the title of my next book, should I ever finish this one. It wasn't long before our senior pastor learned that I'd have memorized the entire book of James, and took the opportunity to show me off a little by inviting me to quote the entire book in front of the men's group meeting. Their meeting was a weekly event that was held just prior to the Sunday evening service. This would become one of my first memories of a major event within ministry. To my surprise and horror, he called me to the platform in the main service to do it again. Though at the last moment, as I approached the pulpit, he limited me to the first 2 chapters. Before you begin thinking that becoming a Christian makes you superhuman, let me share the flip side of this coin that was occurring at the same time. I may have been growing spiritually, in that my understanding of godly things was progressing beyond my years, but my emotional stability was in question. Don't forget that I'm still a teenager at this point with those annoying and very unpredictable hormones. I would later learn from a Christian psychologist that emotional trauma can often cause one to get stuck emotionally at the age when the trauma occurred. Would have been nice to have learned that before I was in my 40s, but I digress. As I became more interested in girls, I would soon discover that the only thing that I wanted to talk about was how hard it was to be without a dad. Somewhere along the line, I'd come to believe that gaining sympathy would win the girl. I would often break down in tears as I tried to communicate those feelings, not realizing that women were not designed to be constantly dumped on in that fashion. At 16, I finally had a steady girlfriend for a very short period, but she quickly grew tired of my emotional state and dumped me rather harshly. I was so devastated that I took my hunting knife and cut my wrist to end my life. I was so tired of feeling all alone. I can't honestly say that I was intent on dying that day because I didn't make it very difficult for my mother to find me in time. However, it did serve to greatly damage what little relationship I had with her. I was now the official problem child. She would later tell me that she wished she'd never had me. I remember how heartbroken I was to hear those words, and I would eventually begin to turn hurt into anger. Can't say that was wise on my part, because it led to even more friction between us down the road. This is not meant to put her in a bad light because I was a huge handful to deal with. There were no books for single moms at the time to give her any guidance on how to deal with a troubled teen. I would be in my mid-40s before we truly made peace with each other, and to my shame, she would pass away just as we were beginning to have a real relationship. Despite it all, she began to take steps to get me help and put me in an environment that might provide answers for me. It would begin with my pastor and youth pastor spending an enormous amount of time with me and would eventually lead to her enrolling me into a Christian school. It was at this Christian school that my life would take an enormous turn for the better, both spiritually and emotionally. I transferred to this school somewhere in my junior year in high school, and it was the first time I'd taken education seriously since my dad left. I'd been a horrible student to that point. Before coming to this Christian school, I had been more interested in honing my martial arts skills to survive the Section 8 housing we moved into after moving out of my uncle's home. The neighborhood was rough. One of my first memories there was when a young girl was raped just 50 yards from our doorstep. I had to learn to protect myself just to survive the bus stop and the bus ride to public school. Being introverted made me appear to be an easy target, but after a summer of training followed by only one fight I had on the school bus, the bullies on the bus decided to leave me alone. The Christian school I now attended had a program that allowed me to learn at my own pace. This allowed me to catch up to my grade level before moving into conventional classes my senior year. It was also the first time I'd been allowed to compete in team sports since my dad left, and I joined the soccer team at the halfway point of the season. It was at this school that I began to learn how to verbalize what I was learning spiritually in a way that might help others. It's also the time frame when I would often ask God why He chose me to endure being raised by a single mom when no one else I knew had to endure the same. His answer would be short and to the point, and He would repeat it several times throughout my life whenever I asked, "Why me?" His response was always the same. He would simply say, "Someone has to go first." One of the first things I ever wrote that year was a poem that I'd quote back to myself every time life threw me a curveball. In the future, I would share this poem with everyone I knew who might be dealing with life-changing circumstances. It goes like this. When tragedy strikes, as it sometimes will, when the heartache keeps coming and coming still, remember this, and on you will live. The heart that hurts most has the most to give. As much insight as I was gaining spiritually, life at home was getting worse. My mother and I were in constant battle with each other, and my rebellious nature would cause such a rift that we would soon part ways. By the beginning of my senior year in high school, I would be living out of my car. It amazes me to this day how much grief knotheads like myself will endure so that we don't have to do what we are told to do. However, God would turn this stubbornness to His advantage decades later, as you will come to see. Just read on. I only knew two things at this point. I knew that somehow, some way, I had to finish high school, and I absolutely could not mess up on my job. As desperate as my situation had become, those two things were my only lifeline. I'd taken a job prior to my leaving home at a Steak and Shake restaurant where I was hired to be a car hop. Not the roller skating kind like you see in old movies. This was a time before drive-through windows became a thing, and there were usually two of us on duty during peak periods to cover around 60 spaces. Cars would back into a numbered space, turn on their headlights to let us know they were ready to order, and we would wait on them for tips just like one would in a dining room. We would take their order from an order book where each page would have a carbon copy and leave our plastic server number on the windshield while we placed their order ticket through a small service window. When their order was ready, our number would be called over a speaker system, and we would return to the same window and deliver their order on a specially designed tray that fits on their window. I had a lot of fun on this job, though weather conditions at times made it a brutal existence. This was a time before fast food restaurants had saturated markets, and finding another job was not very easily done at my young age. So I endured the winter cold, the spring rains, and the summer heat. The whopping $1.63 an hour I made might seem laughable, but the tips made it very livable. I learned quickly that if I worked hard, the tips would reflect my efforts. Laugh if you must at my low wage, but the minimum wage laws that now give employees a false sense that the government is taking care of them financially is a joke. My buying power at that wage was much better than today's higher wages. Again, I digress. That's a topic for yet another book. Mr. Wass, the principal of my Christian school, would soon learn that I was sleeping in my car and offered to let me live with his family to get me off the street. I don't recall flinching at the idea, but I find it very courageous on his part, considering that I was not an easy person to deal with. I recently reconnected with him, and he reminded me of the time I caught a mouse in the gym, tied a string around its neck, and walked it to class like a pet puppy. He must have forgotten the day I got into a fight with his younger son and bloodied his lip. Not to mention the day I caught a wasp, worked the stinger out with my pocket knife, tied a thread around its abdomen, taped the thread to the corner of my English teacher's desk, and when it began to fly, had her pinned in the corner where her desk was while she screamed for help. What a brave man he was for taking me into his home. Not all was lost on me, though. I had the honor of living with what a family should look like by the end of my senior year. I would be so influenced by his family that I was voted in as senior class president. I would also eventually graduate high school and be voted on as the most humorous student. I was finally coming out from behind my protective walls. I consider him one of my greatest mentors. Chapter 8. The Jonah Journey Begins. It was around this time that I would come across yet another great mentor by the name of Pastor Wayne Barquette. I've not mentioned a lot of names in this book, but it was he who suggested that I write this book, so I want to bring his name into the conversation. Especially if this book flops. It was his idea. Seriously, though, he would become one of my greatest mentors and one I would later hurt the most. This book is a testament to God's ability to forgive and to Pastor Barquette's ability to forgive as God does. A gift that only God can inspire. I'm not sure what he saw in me, though. It was partially because I had a crush on his daughter, I'm sure. Keeping a close eye on a scoundrel like me was probably in everyone's best interest at the time. Whatever motivated him in the beginning has certainly made the biggest impact on me spiritually and emotionally. And he would teach me things that would help me learn to be a man and later be successful in business. One of the biggest challenges I had while being raised by a single mom was learning to be a man in the woman's world that I had been living in. Pastor Barquette's home was several miles outside of town and somewhat remote. It had a huge barn behind the house, and That's where my training began. He introduced me to the dirt-floored pulpit in that barn and the congregation of a couple of dogs. He then handed me a small piece of paper with just a few lines written on it. I don't remember the actual verbiage, but that was the message I was to preach to these two dogs. As I recall, his wife and daughters were out of town that day, leaving him responsible for cooking dinner. So as he headed back to the house, his instructions were simple. I was to preach these lines over and over until dinner was ready, and it needed to be loud enough for him to hear from within the house. I didn't understand it at the time, but I would later come to realize that he'd been able to recognize my spiritual gift, and this task was designed to exercise that gift. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't include biblical truth within these pages, and since this marks the beginning of my own journey as an adult, I'd like to reference the Bible account of Jonah, to give you some insight into human nature from a biblical perspective. The book of Jonah is a very short book that contains only 4 short chapters, and though we're taught as children the story of Jonah and the whale, the Bible simply describes it as a great fish. If you are not familiar with this biblical account, let me summarize it in the way many of us were taught in Sunday school. Jonah was a prophet mentioned in the Old Testament portion of the Bible, and would hear God's calling to preach in a way very similar to my own. He was instructed to preach to a city called Nineveh, and the Bible describes his calling as, "The word of the Lord came unto Jonah." He was to preach to that city because God had taken note of their extremely wicked ways. However, instead of following God's instructions, he chose to go in another direction. The Bible describes it in this way. Jonah rose up to flee unto Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. Jonah didn't care to hear God's voice anymore, and so he hopped on a ship, headed to a city called Tarshish, and soon found himself in the middle of a storm at sea. Not a minor storm, mind you, but a storm that had everyone fearing for their lives. The Bible would later describe events that lead to Jonah being thrown overboard, swallowed by a great fish, spending 3 days in that fish's belly, and eventually, at God's bidding, being vomited up on dry land. This story is often taught as a lesson of what happens when we disobey God, but I want you to see the deeper side of this account. Now, before you begin writing this off as just one of those far-fetched Bible stories, let me share a recent news story I ran across. The article was written by Evan Simko Bednarski from CNN on June 12, 2021, and was titled, "Cape Cod Diver Left with a Whale of a Tail After a Humpback Spat Him Out." The diver describes being nearly swallowed by a humpback whale while diving off the coast of Provincetown, Massachusetts. He stated, "I got down to about 45 feet of water, and all of a sudden I just felt this huge bump, and everything went dark. And I could sense that I was moving, and I was like, oh my God, did I just get bit by a shark? Then I felt around, and I realized there was no teeth, and I had felt really no great pain. And then I realized, oh my God, I'm in a whale's mouth. I'm in a whale's mouth, and he's trying to swallow me." He would later discuss his worry about being trapped in a whale's stomach until the air ran out of his tank when suddenly the whale surfaced and spat him out. Mr. Packard was then pulled out of the water by the vessel's captain and was immediately taken to the hospital. There have been other similar stories throughout history, but none as recent that could be verified by witnesses like this one. We don't know much about Jonah's early life in general, though you now know much of mine, and that can be a source of frustration with the Bible. It's also why I want to bring Jonah into the conversation. It's very difficult at times to get a sense of time in the Bible. We don't always get a ton of information about an individual's life, and there are days when it would be nice to know more details within the story. At least, that's how I felt when I began to read the Bible for the first time. The first verse in the book of Jonah states, Now the word of the Lord came unto Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry against it, for their wickedness is come up before me. However, the very next sentence begins like this: But Jonah rose up to flee unto Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. This is a perfect example of a potential time gap, as I was just speaking about. We have no real sense of time between these two sentences, but if I were to inject a little human nature between these two sentences, my guess would be there is a little more to the story. In fact, if you skip to the last chapter of the book, you'll get a sense of Jonah's mindset at the time and gain a little insight into the conversation that Jonah had with God. Don't you just love people who read the last chapter of a book to see how the story ends before they read the book? Me neither, but it's necessary in this case. As I mentioned before, we don't know much about Jonah other than we have come to categorize him as a minor prophet. We don't know what motivated him as an individual or what his training was. We don't know of other things that God may have asked him to do in the past. Even those of us called into ministry have our own dreams of where we want to go, what we want to do, and how we want to be perceived. It's human nature. Maybe Jonah didn't see himself as the minor prophet we've come to call him. Maybe he saw himself becoming like Moses, who parted the Red Sea at God's instruction. Maybe he wanted to see the ground open up and swallow up those who opposed him, or call down fire from heaven as some of the prophets had done. Maybe someone called him Old Baldhead like they did Elisha. See 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 23 and 24. And he thought he should be able to punish those making fun of him by calling a couple of she-bears out of the woods to maul them a bit. Maybe the prophets Elisha and Elijah were his heroes, and he endeavored to be just like them, or what he perceived them to be. There is a lot we don't know, but when we read part of the last chapter of Jonah, we can get an idea. After he had done the opposite of what God had asked, after he'd taken a ride in the belly of a great fish, after he'd been spared by God and vomited up on dry land, we then learn the nature of Jonah's character flaw. We finally learn that Jonah was more interested in his public image as a prophet than watching those trapped in their wicked behavior, coming to truly know God and having their lives changed. Jonah would remind God that he knew the city would repent, and that's why he didn't want to go. We can see that his perception of what a prophet should be was quite different than God's actual plan for his life. This is where my own Jonah journey begins. I would soon fall into the same pitfall. Chapter 9. Calling versus Career. Despite the 2 athletic scholarships I had coming out of high school, I chose to attend Baptist Bible College instead. After a couple of years at Baptist Bible College, preceded by the 2 years at a Christian school, my spiritual gifts were becoming quite obvious, and I was beginning to make a name for myself among my peers. I was invited to preach to youth groups and church events, and witnessed the power of God speak to hearts as I watched dozens of young people come down the aisle to give their lives to Christ. I started a neighborhood Bible club that grew from a modest weekly attendance of 3 to a high of 30 in attendance. I remember a drug pusher threatening me as I was knocking on doors one day, and how he would literally run from me as I began to quote scripture and tell him about Jesus. I saw parents who literally screamed at me in the beginning but soon let their children come to Bible club as their hearts began to soften. There were giants of the faith that I was allowed to be taught under, men who had built massive organizations and colleges, men who were making an impact on the national level that included bringing the majority of evangelical Christians together that led to the election of Ronald Reagan as president. Men who had thousands in attendance at their pastor conferences, and some that had tens of thousands as church members. I saw myself as becoming one of them, But for the moment, I had to attend college while working full-time at Steak and Shake to pay for my schooling. The combination of college, speaking engagements, church attendance, and working full-time was exhausting. The most frustrating part was having to work a full-time job when I believed that I should be in full-time ministry. Somewhere along the line, I had taken my calling and turned it into the potential career I perceived it to be. Frustration set in on several fronts. Not only was I frustrated by the feeling of being trapped in the restaurant world, but I'd been asking God for a wife because I felt I could not be effective in ministry without one. The truth is that my greatest fear was that I would fall prey to sexual misconduct without a wife. I'd been struggling with those types of urges, and it worried me greatly at the time. My mistake at the time was that I didn't seek the help of my mentor. My deepest thoughts were buttoned up tight and hiding behind an image I'd worked hard to achieve. At the time, I felt that I couldn't risk damaging that image by admitting to anyone that I was struggling internally. Up to that point, I'd done everything that was asked of me, and to hear God repeatedly say that I had to wait and trust Him began to work on my every nerve. I grew tired of being satisfied with the struggles God was putting me through. My whole life had been one struggle after the other. One day, I knelt in prayer in the presence of God and just said, "No, I'm not doing this anymore. If you're not going to provide a wife so that I can pursue full-time ministry, then I'll go find a wife on my own and pursue what I want." Chapter 10. Leave me alone. I was angry at God, so angry that I no longer wanted to hear from Him. I, like Jonah, began running from the presence of the Lord. I began doing everything to get God to leave me alone. I began drinking and hanging out with buddies at work. I began dating and developed a serious relationship with a young lady that I would eventually marry. And the last place I wanted to be was in church. There were many who tried to reach out to me, including Pastor Barquette, who graciously asked me to join him in St. Louis, where he was starting a new church. It's very difficult to describe my spiritual and emotional state at the time, other than to say there was a major war going on within me. The world, in general, will tell you to follow your heart, and yet the Bible says the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? I joined Pastor Barquette in St. Louis on a whim and stayed in his home for a few days. I cut ties with the girl I was dating and came to St. Louis, but every night as I lay in bed, I felt I was being pulled in two different directions. I heard the voice of God on one side and felt the emotional tug to return to the girl I wanted to marry on the other. Unfortunately, as we often do, I ignored God again and followed my feelings for her instead. I packed my bag and attempted to quietly sneak out of his home in the middle of the night. I didn't care to face him at that moment, but I wasn't very successful. I must have awakened Pastor Barquette, who met me at the door. He made a gallant effort to get me to make the right decision and stay, but once again, I was allowing myself to be consumed by emotion. I should have known better than to leave. I don't know how many times the principal of my Christian school had said, "Life is built on choices." But I would make a very bad one that night by leaving St. Louis. Once I reconnected with my girlfriend and made plans to marry, I took $50, jumped on my motorcycle, and rode to Dallas, Texas to look for work. I hadn't been there since I was a kid, but I knew that my sister lived somewhere in one of the DFW mid-cities between Dallas and Fort Worth. I rode through the night to avoid traffic and was so tired from the ride that by the time I arrived, I was holding my head up with my left hand. The weight of my helmet had become so heavy that I couldn't keep my head up. I was exhausted. It didn't take long for me to find work. My years at Steak and Shake had paid off, not to mention that the owner of that Steak and Shake franchise I worked for was the former VP of operations for the entire company. I could not have asked for a better place to work as the first job than one owned by Herb Leonard. Herb was one of the most generous men I knew and had been part of Steak and Shake since 1939. He and his handful of managers would grind me daily to develop my skill set, so much so that by the time I got to Dallas, I was very well equipped to compete for a spot in upper management. He inspired me to pay attention to the details, to know more, and work harder than anyone else around me. He taught me that the way I was doing a task was sometimes more important than the task I was actually doing. Let me explain. I was brought into management when Herb opened his third location. Part of my job was to work through the night after we closed, clean the store overnight, and then help manage the staff through breakfast and lunch the following morning. I soon discovered that the back of the store was the hardest to clean because of the grease and such on the floors. So I would begin my routine there and leave the dining room as the last part of the building I cleaned. The dining room was the easiest and quickest part to clean, and my method seemed to be more efficient. It seemed perfect. Until the day I found myself being reprimanded. The problem was that the other opening managers entered through the front door, and because the dining room was still dirty, their perception was that the whole store was dirty. It formed an opinion in their minds that I was slacking on my job. Even though it was less efficient, I began to clean the dining room first, at his request, and the perception of my abilities instantly changed for the better. This knowledge of how perception influences the workplace would help me later when dealing with the politics at the corporate level. Being wise as serpents and harmless as doves comes to mind every time I recall this event. Matthew chapter 10, verse 16. It was exactly 30 days when I returned to Missouri to be married. We headed to Dallas shortly after, but began to experience problems in the marriage almost immediately. She had lived in small-town USA her whole life and did not adapt to big city life at all. I don't blame her at all. And because I had learned to adapt to almost any environment due to my childhood, I couldn't relate, which created even more tension. It wasn't long before we moved back to Missouri, and once again, I tried to settle my life by moving to St. Louis. Even though I was off-center in my life, I thought being close to Pastor Barquette would somehow snap me out of it. I still thought ministry was a possibility in the future, and what better way than to help Pastor Barquette with a church startup? Our first child was born shortly after we arrived in St. Louis, which created even more tension in the home because money became extremely tight. My wife wanted to move back to her hometown to be closer to family, and I didn't. I didn't want to go back to what I perceived was a dead-end job that offered no upward potential. I don't recall why she left to go home, but I interpreted her going home to spend time with her family as a betrayal, and my lack of ability to connect emotionally sent me over the edge. I was still very quick to shut people out and shut down internally to avoid hurt. My reaction was to retaliate by cheating on my wife, which ended our marriage and brought great harm to the church that Pastor Barquette was trying to build. I know that both God and Pastor Barquette have forgiven me for my behavior in those days, but memories and shame of those events haunt me to this very day. I know that I am responsible for hurting a lot of people there in St. Louis, but it would get worse. Much, much worse before I was done. Chapter 11. Soon to be thrown overboard. I took only my clothes when I left St. Louis. I threw all my Bible-related books along with my Christian school yearbook in the dumpster out back and left all my furniture in the apartment behind. There would be no more hesitation on my part as to what direction I was going. I was going anywhere God wasn't. I again ran from the presence of God, but this time I was committed to getting Him to leave me alone for good. When our divorce was over, I shook my hand at God and said, "There, I'm divorced and you cannot use me anymore in the church, so leave me alone." I'd always been taught that a divorcee had no place in the church. As angry as I was and as much damage as I created, God continued to speak to me, so back to Dallas I went. Back to where I was sure I could get him to leave me alone. The timing of my return to Dallas proved to be near perfect. One of the area managers had just been promoted to director of operations, knew of my capabilities, and hired me on the spot. He would quickly promote me to the area manager role he'd just vacated, and it wasn't long before I became his right-hand man. We were the same age, our birthdays being a month apart, so for better and sometimes for worse, he would become like a brother to me. They say that sin loves company, and my friendship with the director of operations proved that to be true. For now, I'll simply call him MW out of respect for his family. MW passed away a few years ago, and I don't know how much his family knows about the questionable dealings that he and I were involved in. I don't know what his actual cause of death was, but I do know that he died in hospice. That could not have been easy for the family to deal with, and for that reason, I've chosen to leave his actual name out. The last thing I want to happen is for a family member to stumble onto this book and be faced with finding out about a side of him they may not have been aware of. MW was the only person to this very day that could and did work harder than me. When it came to business, he was an inspiration to me. I've never met anyone who could work more hours and get less sleep in doing so than MW. I often pushed myself to keep up with him, but was never successful in doing so. It would be impossible to include all the stories of our time as friends, but I will say he always had my back. Even when it was life-threatening to do so, I won't get too deep into the details as to the why, but there were times when my choice of acquaintances put my life in danger. I didn't see who it was that took a shot at me, but a bullet came through the window of one of our restaurants, missing my head by a couple of inches. I would later learn that 2 contracts had been put out on me. MW was standing near me, and while I scrambled out of the restaurant, he paid for a customer's meal because glass from the window had ended up in their food. I drove home as quickly as I could, only to discover that someone had also broken into my apartment. MW knew that I was headed home, so he stopped by his house to get his gun and met me there. It was very late at night, and my building was not very well lit at the time. It would be risky to enter an unlit apartment, not knowing if those looking for me were still there. We'd previously been involved in rescuing a friend from a dangerous situation, so this wasn't the first time we'd entered an apartment with guns drawn. However, we'd had time to case a place in the past, to know where everyone in the apartment was and if they were armed. The only reason I had stopped by my apartment was to gather some clothes and leave town for a bit. Once I realized the gravity of the situation, I decided to walk away, leaving everything behind. Choosing life over possessions is never easy, but neither is taking a bullet in the head. I stayed off the grid over the next 6 months while constantly staying on the move through several states. I made no phone calls or contacted anyone I knew for the entire time, and I did not stay in one place very long. I'd gotten rid of my car and hitched a ride with my sister and her husband with the promise of work that would pay me with cash only. They traveled to several states doing construction work, and in traveling with them, no one knew where I was or where I was going. I would end up as far north as Ohio and as far east as Virginia before I was able to calm the situation down back in Texas. This would not be the only time I'd been shot at over the years, but I wanted to help the reader understand just how close MW and I were. I was crushed when I learned of his death, and still don't understand why I was allowed to live and not him. When I returned, I would eventually get married again, but by the time I was 25 years old, I'd be divorced a second time. That marriage would last less than a year, and only lasted that long because she was pregnant, and we were unable to divorce until after the baby was born. I would once again shake my hand at God and say, I dare you to use me now. I've been divorced not once, but twice. There's no way for you to use me now. I would run even further away from God, and yet God was still speaking to me. It would be my third marriage that shaped events that would make it impossible to control my circumstances. I say marriage, but we would later find out our marriage had been nullified because our license had never been filed. For the sake of the story, I'll stick with married because we would not discover this fact until we tried to divorce years later. Life can get very complicated when you run from God, as hard as I did. We'd been married around 3 years when events took shape that would change my life forever, and if you think I had suddenly become an honest citizen and faithful husband, think again. Living in the Dallas-Fort Worth area made it very easy to live two lives. I could be one person in Fort Worth where my family lived, and could be a completely different person in Dallas where I worked. I could attend family events in Fort Worth and continue the most ungodly behavior in Dallas at the same time. No one knew, and no one ever discovered my many secrets. The restaurant business had been good to me during these years, and for the most part, I'd accomplished most of the things that were important to me at the time. I'd risen to the corporate level with the original chain I'd worked for and became the right arm of the director of operations, making me the number 3 guy in the chain of 53 restaurant locations. When the owner sold the concept, I easily transitioned into a similar role with a national restaurant chain. It was not uncommon for me to work 100+ hours a week and party 7 days a week. Getting God to leave me alone was not as easy as I thought. I tried desperately to fill my day with things that kept my mind occupied and my nights with alcohol, and yet he was still speaking to me. Quite annoying at the time. My career would eventually take me to Anderson, Indiana, which is 30 miles north of Indianapolis. I had lived in states in the far north before, but I don't ever remember weather as cold as this place. 23 degrees below zero that first winter with a wind chill of 43 degrees below zero was not my idea of a fun life at all. I decided to develop a side business in an attempt to leave the restaurant business and gain a little more control of my life and where I lived. The long hours it took to be successful in that business had taken its toll, and I was very tired. My attitude at work tanked. I couldn't live 2 lives there in that small town, and I would eventually get fired as a result of my arrogant behavior. In all fairness, though, this was the first time in my career I could not get along with my superiors. Their decisions seemed incompetent, and I worked too hard over the years, in my opinion, to be strapped to incompetence. We'd only been there a year when we got the call that would change everything. It was my mother-in-law on the line telling my wife that her dad had just had a major heart attack and was not expected to live through the weekend. We were 1,300 miles away from her family in Corpus Christi, Texas, and there was no consoling my wife. So we began preparing to head to Texas and hopefully arrive before he passed away. I called a couple of former employees of mine and asked them to watch the house and feed the dog while we were gone, packed our bags, and stopped by the bank to take out a few $100s for the trip. It was after hours, so I had to use the ATM, and though I knew I had a couple of checks still outstanding that would not clear, I had money coming in from my business that I had instructed the guys watching our house to deposit for me on Monday. Off we went on our 18-hour drive to Texas. What was supposed to be a trip that would take a few days ended up being several weeks. Her dad came through the surgery with flying colors and was expected to make a full recovery. Meanwhile, I continued to try and reach the 2 guys I left in charge of my home while I was away with no success. I began calling my home phone hoping to catch them at the house, and to my amazement, found myself speaking to a detective who answered the phone one night. He explained that someone had entered the house, stolen what they could, and destroyed everything that was left. Based on what he told me, there was nothing left and nothing to return to. I had no idea that this event was the equivalent of Jonah being cast overboard, and that God was preparing a great fish, so to speak, that would arrive to swallow me up. It didn't take long for us to decide to remain in Texas. What was the point of returning when there was nothing worth returning for? I began looking for work and a place to live. I'd trailered my motorcycle down with us when we made the trip to Texas, with the intent to sell it if necessary, to make the trip a little more tolerable financially. Once the decision to stay was made, I sold it to afford an apartment and to give us enough time to get on our feet. Once again, I returned to the restaurant business as a living and began starting life over. It wasn't long before we found out my wife was pregnant with twins, sending us into total panic mode. After all that had happened, we were hardly ready for one child, much less two. We limited ourselves to a one-bedroom apartment and began sticking a little money back. In the meantime, I began looking for a newer car to replace the car we currently owned. It had been a good car, but was getting old and potentially unreliable. The last thing I wanted was to be a father of twins and have car trouble. There was only one obstacle between us and the new car we'd been approved for. While living in Indiana, I'd never bothered to convert my driver's license to that state. I'd continued to drive on my Texas driver's license for no other reason than one is never quite sure when a business will move you to another state. In fact, I was caught a little off guard when I was sent to Indiana. We'd scheduled a day to sign the loan documents and had written a check for our down payment, but on the day we were to sign, the dealership called and informed me that I needed to renew my Texas license because it had expired. I agreed to do so, but in the process, learned that Texas had put a hold on my ability to renew. Prior to us moving to Indiana, I'd been rear-ended by another driver and didn't have a copy of my insurance with me. The state would not renew my license until I could prove that I had insurance at the time of the accident. I had two choices. I could mail in proof of insurance and wait the estimated 30 days for clearance, or I could drive to Austin, provide the proof, and make my way to the nearest DMV to have my license renewed. I'm sure you've already discovered that patience was not one of my better traits at the time, so I chose the latter of the two choices and headed to Austin with my brother-in-law riding shotgun. For the most part, the process started out being quite uneventful. I provided proof, renewed my license at the Austin DMV, and was standing at the corner waiting for my license copy when an officer stepped forward with a request that confused and startled me at the same time. As I was handed my newly renewed license, he said, "Mr. Baker, I need you to step behind the counter for me, please." As I did, he informed me that I was being detained. I don't recall being too concerned initially. I'd been arrested before for failing to pay tickets on time, and I assumed this was about one I missed before moving to Indiana. Working 100-hour work weeks for most of my career didn't leave a lot of time to be bothered by what I considered to be minor stuff like outstanding traffic tickets. I'd been ticketed several times before, usually for the same faulty headlight I'd never taken the time to get replaced. Each time, an officer would show up at my door in the middle of the night, arrest me on a bench warrant, take me to jail where I'd pay my fine and go home. Occasionally, I'd have to spend several hours behind bars until I was allowed to bond out. Friday nights were the worst times to be arrested because you were locked up with all the drunks. Sometimes I was locked up in an overcrowded two-man cell with 5 others, waiting to be processed. On one occasion, the officer let me follow him in my own car to the station. The DMV officer now put me in a holding cell, and he said he needed to find out what the issue was. He returned very quickly with a confused look on his face. He informed me that the state of Indiana had placed a fugitive warrant on me. Not just any warrant, mind you. but a $50,000 cash warrant. At the time of this writing, that $50,000 would be the equivalent of $100,000 in today's money. I didn't have that kind of money laying around. Who does? We spoke briefly with each other, and the officer told me that in his 25-plus year career, he'd never seen a warrant that required that much cash. He went on to tell me that he needed to contact Indiana and that I would remain in the holding cell until he heard back from them. After what seemed like an eternity, the officer returned to let me know that he'd not heard back yet, but was only going to give them a couple more minutes and would release me if he did not hear back. He recommended that if he didn't hear back from Indiana, that my next stop should be an attorney to get this taken care of. Those had to be the longest 2 minutes of my life. There was a wall clock on the holding cell, and I watched every second click off as the second hand moved around the clock. 2 minutes remained. Then 1 minute to freedom remained. 30 seconds. With 15 seconds remaining, I began to gather my things and prepared to be released. Just as I began to feel a sense of relief, I heard the fax machine go off in the next room, and my heart sank. The officer opened the door and informed me that Indiana had just responded. I was now going to jail. This was no longer about an unpaid ticket. This was serious, and I knew it. Chapter 12. Jonah had his whale, and Michael went to jail. I began to wonder where my brother-in-law was around this time. The whole process had taken over 2 hours. As the officer put me in cuffs, I asked if he would go outside and give my wallet and car keys to my brother-in-law. When the officer returned to transport me to jail, he made me aware that he'd explained the situation to my brother-in-law. He'd fallen asleep in the car but now had my wallet and car keys to get home. As I mentioned before, sitting in the back of a squad car was nothing new to me. What was new was that I was not going home that day. Being booked and processed into the city jail was the first step. And if you've ever wondered why arrestees look so mean in their mugshot, just know that the picture part comes later. At the time of my arrest, the jail was not required to give me so much as a toothbrush until I had been locked up for 72 hours. And the mugshot? Well, that would come at 3 a.m. after being wakened out of a dead sleep and having had nothing as simple as a comb to straighten up with. Just imagine how innocent you would look in a picture when wakened at 3 a.m. with bedhead. I remember that the cell floor of the jail was not a solid floor. It was a grated floor of some sort, and I could see hundreds of roaches crawling underneath it. I can only assume that it was built that way to allow things to fall through and keep the roaches from getting into the actual cell. As I recall, my time there would cross the dreaded Friday night drunks because there is no mistaking the sound of drunks throwing up all night. I cried a little when I made the first call to my wife. Don't let the tough guys fool you. We all cry on that first call when we've been charged with a serious crime. At the time, I'd not been in front of an actual judge to even know what I was being charged with. I know that most people who have never been to jail are appalled by the fact that there are phones there in the common areas, but I'll let you in on a little secret. It's not what you think. I don't know if things have changed since I was locked up, but every call made while I was in jail had to be made as a collect call, and my family was charged 3 times the normal cost of a collect call when I did. It didn't take much time at all to rack up a bill so large that the family couldn't pay the bill. The last thing you wanted to be was cut off from the outside world. I made very few calls. It was a day or two when I was transferred to the county jail facility and made aware of my actual charges. There were 2: theft and defrauding a financial institution. I had no idea what they were talking about. I would find out later that the 2 guys that were to make the deposit for me never did. In fact, the money magically disappeared and an outstanding check bounced, Because my house had been ransacked, everything taken, and the rest destroyed, the Indiana detectives interpreted that as an act of theft. They assumed that I'd taken a large sum of money out of my account, knowing that there were checks that wouldn't clear, and fled the state. None of which was true. Naturally, I pled not guilty. I hadn't stolen money from anyone. I was taken to a large holding facility within the county jail, where inmates were kept on a temporary basis. It was a mixed bag of inmates with a range of charges from shoplifting to murder. But for the most part, it was calm, even though I'd estimate the number of inmates in there to be around 50 or 60. Only an occasional fight or two over a card game. It did become a powder keg just before I was moved to a more permanent pod when the state of Texas outlawed cigarettes among inmates. I don't remember much about that first week except for the strip searches. Not individual strip searches done in private, mind you, but being shoved into a room with 40 other inmates being searched at the same time. Everyone made to strip naked and bend over while officers stuck their fingers in places that left you feeling violated in every sense of the word. I don't think I've ever been as embarrassed as that first strip search, before or after that day. There came a day when I was called out of that pod and handed a piece of paper to sign. Understand that I had yet to be allowed to see an attorney of any kind. I'd not even seen the public defender I requested. I was told that Indiana wanted to extradite me and that signing this would waive my rights so they could get this over quickly. I'm not sure what I said at the time other than, not happening. But I would learn later that they flagged my file as uncooperative and transferred me to what was considered the worst pod in that county jail. Picture this. At the time, I'm a pretrial detainee charged with a blue-collar nonviolent crime, and they were moving me to a pod filled with murderers, cop killers, and child molesters in an effort to break my will and get me to sign over my rights. Almost everyone in that pod was there waiting to catch the chain back to prison because they had violated their parole or had committed another crime. In fact, I now found myself locked up with one of the most famous cop killers in Texas named David Lee Powell, who was there on retrial. It would be several weeks before I was allowed to see my public defender. It didn't take me long to realize just how dangerous some of these men were. I don't know how many times I heard an inmate named Nevels cry out that they should never let him out because he would never stop killing cops. I found myself in an environment where reaching in front of someone for the salt at meals could get you killed. And yet, God was still speaking to me. I have to admit that I was a little more interested in listening to what he had to say at this point. My cellmate ended up being a blessing even though he scared me to death at first. Willie J. was his name, and he was the biggest black man I'd ever seen in my life to that point. The worst mistake you can make in an environment like that is to trust anyone or accept a favor from anyone. Trust no one. Payment of that debt of a favor could land you additional charges for what was called a free world case, or put you in the morgue if the favor was not returned. Willie J. was different, though. For whatever reason, God gave me favor with Willie J., and not only did he watch my back and teach me how to survive in there, but we also became good friends. His first lesson was how to play a domino game called Double Knot. 4 players would play a straight line of dominoes, and the player who could get rid of his domino hand first was the winner. However, the player with the most points left in his hand had to get down and do that number of push-ups. Needless to say, I didn't appear to be very good at that game. But after 500 push-ups in that first game, I finally realized why. While I was doing push-ups, the other 3 players were arranging the dominoes on the table so they could quickly grab what they wanted, leaving me with the high-point dominoes. Didn't I just say, trust no one? Once I caught on and managed to get up off the floor, raked all the dominoes off the table and said a few unkind words in response to their cheating, the place erupted in laughter. I'd just learned my first lesson from Willie J. The next morning, I couldn't lift my arms for the pain of the previous day's push-ups. I wish I had time to share more stories about Willie J, but there is someone else I need to speak about. Once a week or so, there was an old man who was allowed onto the pod pushing a cart loaded with books. Inmates could take a book, read it, and return it to the cart or not the following week when he came through. My first book choice was a Gideon Bible that I found on the cart. It was blue in color and appeared to be almost new. As I sat on my bunk and opened its pages, I once again began to hear the voice of God, only this time I began to listen. I soon discovered that this Bible had been in the hands of someone else before me, though I had no idea who. I found a few passages in Psalms that had been highlighted in what almost looked like crayons. I'm not exactly sure what it had actually been highlighted with, but a couple of the marked verses seemed to nearly jump off the page at me. It was Psalm 142. I cried unto the Lord with my voice. With my voice unto the Lord did I make my supplication. I poured out my complaint before him. I shewed before him my trouble. When my spirit was overwhelmed within me, then thou knewest my path. In the way wherein I walked have they privily laid a snare for me. I looked on my right hand and beheld, but there was no man that would know me. Refuge failed me. No man cared for my soul. I cried unto thee, O Lord. I said, Thou art my refuge and my portion in the land of the living. Attend unto my cry, for I am brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutors, for they are stronger than I. Bring my soul out of prison, that I may praise thy name. The righteous shall compass me about, for thou shalt deal bountifully with me. I don't know that I can explain what began to happen to me that day, except to say it was the beginning of my restoration. I'm in no way suggesting that life would change instantly for me. There will always be a price to pay for bad decisions, but once God lays his hands on things, all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose. Romans chapter 8, verse 28. Chapter 13. It ain't over till it's over. A few months passed, and Indiana was able to secure a governor's warrant that allowed them to extradite me back to Indiana. They had been on the clock this whole time with only 90 days to secure that warrant from Texas, or I'd have to be released by law. However, on day 90, they were there to transport me back to Indiana. Normally, I would not be allowed to take anything with me when being extradited. Not even commissary items that I had purchased were allowed and had to be left behind. For whatever reason, the detectives allowed me to take the Gideon Bible with me. It was the only thing that stayed with me from start to finish. Still don't think God was in all this? There had been just too many coincidences along the way to deny it. The past few months had allowed me to reconnect with God in a genuine way, and I would need it more than ever now. I was shackled, driven to the airport, made to walk through the airport in shackles, and placed in the middle seat between two detectives, still in shackles, as if I'd killed someone and was considered a danger to the public. Outside of the strip searches, this was the most humiliating part of my journey. By the time we reached Indiana, both detectives realized I was no threat to anyone, removed the shackles, and placed me in their car. When we arrived at the county jail, the officer apologized and said he had to put the shackles back on before entering the building so he wouldn't get in trouble. I was okay with that. Once again, I was thrown into a high-risk pod that I didn't belong in. Most of the guys in that pod were in on felony drug charges. All but one. Freddie was his name, and it was obvious that he was king of the pod. Freddie had spent the last 7 years in prison for murder, had been released on parole just 2 weeks before my arrival, and was now locked up again on another murder charge. The racial tension in this jail was extremely high, and unlike in Texas, no effort was made to separate the cliques. If a fight broke out in Texas, the guards were in the pod locking it down in mere moments. Not so in Indiana. It could be an hour before help arrived, and guards would not enter the pod until it was all over. Whatever over meant. It was far more dangerous than the previous jail, but Willie J. had taught me well because the first day I was there, Freddie tried to force me to pay him for my phone time because, according to him, he owned the phones. Willie J. had made sure that my time in that Texas jail was spent well by working out every day and reading every day. Every time he caught me in a depressed state, trying to sleep the day away, he'd wake me up and say, "Don't nothing come to a sleeper but a dream." I'd learned that under no circumstances I was to back down if attacked. Take the beating if I must, but never back down. If I ever backed down from an attack, the torment would never stop. Fear and respect were the only tools that could keep you alive. So I squared off with Freddie. I was very thankful that I had gotten in peak condition over the last several months because he bought what I was selling and let it go for the time being. I didn't know it at the time, but white inmates were not allowed to congregate in a cell together for any reason. Of the 14 or so inmates in this pod, there were only 3 Caucasians. I was warned that if I didn't stop congregating that I would be raped by the rest of the inmates. I'm not saying that I wasn't scared, but I was more infuriated by the threats than anything else. I remembered an account in the Bible when David faked insanity by acting crazy and letting spittle run down his chin. I went into a rage and started throwing everything I could out my cell door, including the mattresses. I stepped to my cell door frothing at the mouth and screaming, "This is my house, and no one tells me what to do in my house. You all may jump me and rape me, but the first person I get my hands on is going to die. Now's the time if you're ready," I shouted. On most days, that behavior would start a riot, but God must have placed fear in their hearts because from that day forward, no one bothered me. Everyone knew that I read my Bible, prayed every day, and had always tried to get along, but on that day, I became the crazed Christian that no one wanted to mess with. Even Freddie returned the commissary items he'd stolen from me while I was out of the pod in court a few days prior. I learned a lot during my jail time. I learned that real public defenders are not what you see on TV. I'd already experienced the realization in Texas that most could care less about you and certainly won't do much more than negotiate a plea agreement. I learned that when I met with my Texas public defender. His response when I asked him to contact my family as witnesses was, "Not unless you pay me." So I wasn't expecting much more from my public defender in Indiana. I started our conversation by telling him that my family members were preparing testimony affidavits because they couldn't travel due to my father-in-law's recent heart surgery. His response was, "Affidavits are considered hearsay in Indiana and are inadmissible, so unless you can bond out and prepare a defense, you're going to prison." I had to catch my breath after that statement. I asked him about negotiating probation since I'd never been arrested for anything but a traffic ticket. "If you can't bond out, you are going to prison," was his response. Though this time he intensified his tone to drive home his point. I didn't see any point in continuing our conversation any longer, so I made it clear that I was not pleading guilty to something I didn't do, and that I'll take my chances at trial. He reminded me that the average trial date in Indiana would be at least 18 months to 2 years away, for which my last response was, "See you in 2 years." I went back to my cell and prepared myself for the long haul. That whole conversation felt like when my dad was slapping the back of my head to force me to eat coleslaw, and I was not about to comply. Not everyone can handle being locked up for any length of time, but I was determined. I'd already seen inmates lose their senses and try to commit suicide after only 2 weeks of incarceration. I knew that I had to get my mind straight to survive this. I'd also seen other families break up over time. Wives would divorce their husbands or start cheating on their spouses. I'd seen inmates being disowned by their friends and families who were unable to endure the embarrassment of a loved one going to jail. I was not fooling myself into believing my situation was going to be any different. My family was 1,300 miles away at this point, and I didn't get a single visit from anyone even when I was in a Texas jail. I'd already assumed a similar outcome for myself. Chapter 14. When you think it can't get any worse. I don't remember how many days went by after that meeting with an attorney. When settling in for the long haul, it is not wise to start counting days. I do remember waking up angry one morning and not knowing why. I sat down and wrote a few simple words in my journal. I need to watch myself today, I wrote. I was worried that I'd say the wrong thing in anger to the wrong inmate and create a problem for myself. Angry people say stupid things, so when I was finished, I lay back down and went back to sleep, hoping to wake up in a better mood. I was awakened by guards telling me to come with them because I had a phone call. Every eye in the place was on me at that moment. Incoming phone calls in jail were never good, and this one was no exception. It was my mother-in-law on the phone, and I could barely make out what she was saying through her tears. "They're dead," was all I could make out. "Who is dead?" I asked. "The babies are dead." She finally got out. With all the stress I was under, I hadn't given much thought to my wife being pregnant with twins at the time. But this revelation spun my thoughts into chaos. As she gained her composure, she began to tell me that my wife's water had broken prematurely, and she'd been taken to a hospital. That hospital had transported her to another hospital that supposedly had better abilities with premature births, and the initial hospital monitored all their vitals during transport. As I understood the conversation at the time, my wife had been left alone for several hours and had started giving birth alone. Our first daughter was strangled on the umbilical cord, and our second daughter died of trauma shortly after birth. There are no words to describe what I was feeling at the time. I'd drawn close to God again over the last few months, but this news broke me of any will of my own. I'd reached my breaking point. All eyes were on me again as I returned to my cell. I'd been called Reverend from time to time while in jail, so it was obvious everyone perceived me as one who was getting it together. I walked into my cell, sat on the edge of the toilet, and began to sing a song that I remembered from when I was in Bible college. When you're up against the struggles that shatter all your dreams, when your hopes have been cruelly crushed by Satan's manifested schemes, when you feel the urge within you to submit to earthly fear, don't let the faith you're standing in seem to disappear. Praise the Lord, He can work through those who praise Him. Praise the Lord, for our God in heaven is great. Praise the Lord, for the chains that seem to bind you serve only to remind you that they fall powerless behind you when you praise Him. I went to my bunk, laid down, and went to sleep. As far as I was concerned, life was over. All hope was now gone. The only thing I knew was that I was talking to God. God was talking to me, and as far as everything else was concerned, there was nothing left to fight for. Now, I don't know exactly how long I slept. I just remember that I was awakened by the guards and told to come with them because I had to appear in court. I was a bit confused because this was now the first of the year. It's a holiday. We don't have court on holidays. As I entered the courtroom, I noticed there were very few lights on, just enough light to allow each of us to see each other. I remember seeing the judge sitting behind the bench, the district attorney at one table to the left, and my attorney sitting at a table to his right. My attorney was in the process of relaying to the judge that my children had died and was asking the judge to make arrangements for me to go home, bury my children, and immediately return to Indiana. However, the district attorney was not interested in doing any of that, stating over and over that I was guilty and he was continuously pointing a finger at me. He would continue with, "If he is not going to enter a guilty plea, then we're out. There's no deal here. If he wants to go home and bury his children, he's going to have to say, 'I'm guilty on both charges,' or 'there's no deal here.'" The judge turned to look at me and asked, "Do you understand what he's saying, son?" When I replied, "Yes, sir," I knew that I had just a few seconds to make a choice. I could either go home and take care of my family and accept these untrue charges, or I could resist being told what to do as I'd always done and spend the next 2 years or more in jail waiting for trial. It wasn't a hard choice at the time. God had broken my will with the death of my children, so I pled guilty to both charges. I almost had to laugh, but didn't, when the judge reduced my bond from $50,000 cash to $500 cash. Still don't think God was in this? Can't deny it now, though. It wasn't quite over, because after several months in jail, I didn't have a dime. A brother-in-law graciously wired money to my attorney, who then paid it for me. He sent me enough money for a bus ticket home, and enough for that cheeseburger I mentioned at the very beginning. There was a lesson to be learned through all of this, and believe me, I was now listening. I don't care who you are, how tough you are, or how deserving you think you are. When you stand before a judge, you no longer have control. Absolutely none. You are at the mercy of the judge. It was in that courtroom that I began to understand what my salvation was all about. I had entered a guilty plea when I came to Christ, even though I didn't bring sin into the world. I'm not Adam and Eve. I didn't make that choice. I'm just the guy that it all fell on. My spiritual destiny had been determined before I was even born. To be set free, I had to enter a guilty plea. I was guilty of being a sinner by birth, and my guilty plea on that Halloween night had allowed Jesus to take my punishment for me so that I could be free. I also began to understand the pain of a father whose child had to die so that freedom could be arranged. My children had to die to set up a situation where I could enter a guilty plea and go free. Salvation is the same. God sent His Son to die to create an environment for us to come before God, confess our guilt as a sinner, believe in our hearts that God has raised Him from the dead, and be set free spiritually. Chapter 15. A cheeseburger never tasted so good. Upon my release, and after I had gulped down that glorious cheeseburger, I was once again reminded of Jonah and that great fish when it puked him out. That's exactly how I felt at the time. I'd just been puked out into that freezing cold weather. I began to remember a message from years back when a pastor tried to help us visualize Jonah after being puked up. Jonah had to be smelling mighty ripe at that moment, and it's quite possible that the acidic nature of the fish's stomach had bleached his skin. There I stood with a past that literally stunk and a life that had been bleached of all its innocence. I made my way to the bus station on foot, where I had a ticket waiting for me. There were no cell phones at the time, and using a public phone was expensive. Unlike today with our cell phones, making a call from an Indiana payphone to Texas would exhaust what little funds I had. And making a collect call home would cost the family money. So I made no effort to call home. I'd need what little I had left to eat a little during the long bus ride home. 26 hours, as I recall. A true test of endurance, to say the least. I don't remember much about the bus station other than those hard plastic seats were very uncomfortable, and I have no recollection of how long it took my bus to arrive other than it was daylight when I reached the station, and it was dark outside when my bus was boarding. However, I do remember being near last in line while waiting to get on a bus that appeared to be reaching full capacity. It was a miserable feeling because it was all I could do to hold back tears at this time. The death of my daughters was beginning to settle in on me emotionally. I didn't feel like being around people at all that night, and the thought of being on a crowded bus only made it worse. Something interesting happened just before I got on the bus, though. Suddenly, the driver realized that his bus had been overbooked and scrambled to find a solution. The bus was at capacity, and there were several of us who were not able to get on. It took some time for the station to figure out what to do, but in the end, it was decided that the rest of us would be placed on a second bus. A second bus, mind you, where I spent the entire way home with only a handful of people on board. A second bus where I was able to lay in the seats all to myself, separated from the rest of the passengers, and where I wept most of the way home without drawing attention to myself. One might write it off as just a coincidence, but I knew it was the hand of God that night, providing a means by which I could finally grieve a little in peace. Chapter 16. A New Beginning. First Steps. I wrote this book for two reasons. I wanted to help those in desperate situations to truly understand the love of God that operates despite all the horrible circumstances that life can bring. I also wanted Christians to understand that God is never going to let you go. If you choose to run, He's always waiting for you to come home. And trust me, you'll come home of your own volition, or you'll come home kicking and screaming as I did. God loves you that much despite what you think you've done. I'm not saying that actions don't have consequences, but I will say there is no place like home. My rebellious journey cost me everything, but over the years, God has restored it all, and then some. I'm not going to insult your intelligence by suggesting that I immediately got myself together after this experience. Spiritually, I was on my way. Emotionally, it would take many years to overcome those deficiencies. It would be quite some time before I could effectively navigate a marriage properly. One does not always make their way out of the darkness in the blink of an eye, and I certainly didn't escape from the darkness without some significant scars. But as I stated earlier, if you are willing to endure the hardships long enough, turn everything over to a loving God and Savior, there is a blessing in it, and there is always a way. One of my mentors once told me that almost anything is possible. The impossible just takes a little longer. I walked away from that jail with 2 felony convictions and was unable in my mind to return to any substantial career. Every position I had previously been in required that I pass a background check. Need I say more? But that's not where the story ends. Not even close. As I mentioned, I didn't find restoration immediately, and I initially made the mistake of trying to give God a little help. Old habits are hard to break, and my unwillingness to wait on God took center stage once again. I knew that my convictions wouldn't show up on a background check until after sentencing, which would occur a few months after my release. So I quickly applied for a role as a national trainer for a national restaurant chain to get ahead of it. I was hired, and for a year, it all seemed to go well. I was proud of how I'd beaten the system and was able to immediately jump back into a worthwhile career. God, on the other hand, had other plans as to the direction my path was to take. During that first year, I'd taken over one of the 3 national training stores responsible for training all managers placed around the country. I'd developed a great relationship with my immediate supervisor and thought I was well on my way again. That would soon change when my supervisor was replaced with someone the company had hired from outside of the organization. My original supervisor moved on to take a different role within the company. One of the things I was developing in my store was the use of a rented computer to help manage the massive inventories and responsibilities that I had. At the time, I was the only training manager without any assistant managers and was unable to delegate some of those tasks. I'd had complete autonomy in monies spent on store operations in the past, if they were within budget, but the new supervisor saw things differently. I don't know if it was because he was new to the company and was never made aware of what I was doing, or if he just didn't like me, but he fired me over it. Ironically, he was also fired just a few weeks later because of unethical behavior. That termination forced me into a minimum wage job at the age of 31 because I couldn't pass a background check. God made it very clear that I needed to wait for him. First things first, he reminded me. Some character issues needed some work first, not to mention reputation. Restoration requires change, and sometimes God allows events to force change if we are to move forward. There was nothing wrong with the job I lost in and of itself. The problem was in my motivation when pursuing that job. I was looking for a shortcut back to the top, not realizing that God had bigger and better things for me that required a much longer route. I spent a couple of years working for this employer at minimum wage, but eventually, I earned enough respect from the owner that he referred me to another owner who was having trouble in his business and was experiencing significant losses. He needed someone with restaurant management experience to help him figure out where the losses were occurring and help him back to being profitable. This opportunity was a godsend and would bring a significant increase in income, though it would take an enormous physical toll. I entered the business at first as a customer to see what was going on within its walls. I watched as an employee took a couple of boxes of product out to the freezer, out the back door, and placed them in his car. I watched friends of employees enter the store, jump over the counter, and make their food of choice without paying for it. You can only imagine the look on their faces when I introduced myself as their new boss and fired all but one employee. One employee was so upset with me that he returned with a gun and began shooting cars until the police arrived and removed him. This owner had 2 locations that were open 24 hours a day, and my first act of management would require several weeks of very little sleep until I was able to hire and train more employees. It was exhausting as I only got 2 hours of sleep every 42 hours for the first few weeks. However, one of my new hires would eventually open yet another door that would create an even better opportunity down the road. God was teaching me that one step forward, and sometimes one step backward, would lead to better opportunities if I would approach each by faith and trust Him to open doors for me. Every step He asked me to take, even if it appeared to go backward, would teach me what I needed to know for the blessing of the future. The key is to absorb everything you experience in any given situation in a spirit of thankfulness. Understand that growth does not always come from what you put in your head, but often from what you learn to keep out of your head. I sometimes think we get it backward. We often express our feelings as human beings having a spiritual experience, when it might be better said that we are spirits having a human experience. At some point, The owner I was working for made the decision to sell his business. Prior to buying the 2 restaurants, he'd been a middle manager for IBM and came to the realization that this was not a good fit for him. I spent the rest of my time there helping him boost the numbers to make the business attractive to a buyer. Remember the employee that I mentioned earlier who would open another door for me? He'd left the business by this time when his brother-in-law was able to get him hired on at a car dealership selling cars. We'd become good friends during this time at the restaurant, and we'd kept in touch. God would now use him to open a door for me at the same dealership. This was one of the scariest moments for me. Taking this job meant a complete career change in a field I knew nothing about, and God was nudging me to take it. I really didn't want to take this step, because I'd tried breaking into sales a couple of times before, selling China sets and insurance, which was a total failure on my part. The thought of selling cars did not initially leave me with a feeling of confidence. It scared me to death. And I had long conversations with God about this move. What in the world was he thinking? In my mind, there was no way I could do this successfully. I had no skill set whatsoever in the field of sales and had a history to prove it. However, that is what faith is all about. The Bible says, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. And believe you me, I wasn't seeing it. I closed my spiritual eyes and took the leap. Chapter 17. A New Career Path. When I arrived at the dealership for my first day, I was immediately told to just watch. I wasn't allowed to do so much as speak to a customer until I had permission to do so. I'll never forget that first day. I'd positioned myself near the front door so that I could watch and listen to salespeople doing their thing when suddenly, I heard a customer come out of an office yelling cuss words at the top of his lungs. Just as he reached the door next to me, a set of keys came sailing through the air, missing his head by inches as they hit the door. My first thought was, what have I gotten myself into? Or more specifically, what has God gotten me into? It only got worse from there. After a week of observation, I'd still not been allowed to attempt a sale. I was convinced that I was on a path to starvation if that continued, so I decided to take a customer anyway and let management figure out how to deal with me. I honestly believe that is what they were waiting for. They were waiting to see if I had the courage to take the initiative. I received my first lesson in the car business a couple of days later when I made my first sale. The process after selling a new car was called new car delivery, where I was to teach the customer how to use the features of their new car as well as walk them through their owner's manual. I'd been successful with the features, but I was having trouble finding a particular page in the owner's manual. So I asked my good friend what page the information was on. He gave me the page number and immediately walked back to the office and put his name on my deal as co-salesperson. That one question cost me half my commission that day and gave me a good education on how brutal the car business was going to be. It felt like I was back in jail. Once again, I found myself in an environment where I could trust no one. I could not let my guard down for a moment because there were 25 of us on the sales floor, and the other 24 went to great lengths to get me to quit. Every salesperson there would not hesitate to rob me of income if I asked for help in any way. Even management would force me to split my deal if I failed to follow every sales step to the letter. And it was not uncommon in those days for salespeople to step out back and settle their differences in a fistfight. I decided at that point that I would have to step up as I did in jail, get much tougher, and stand my ground before I starved to death. It took a full year, but eventually, I was accepted as a bona fide member of the sales team. The car business at that time was like a fraternity. Once you survived the first year's hazing, you were officially a car dog. Chapter 18. Slipping. Though the car business would eventually become a huge blessing financially, it came with its own temptations. I was still living in Fort Worth and drove to the dealership every day, which just happened to be minutes from Dallas, and you guessed it, living two lives was once again on the table. Car dogs love to drink, and every night at close, someone was sent to the liquor store for what was called the beer run. Actually, there was more Crown Royal than beer, but I digress. Salespeople and management would remain on the property until all the booze was gone and would often head to a club afterward. It wasn't long before I was immersed in the club world again, though nowhere near the degree I once was. The problem was that I'd spent so much money in clubs as a restaurant executive that I was very well known in Dallas. Once the car dogs realized what connections I had, they attempted to make me their go-to guy in the clubs. When I quit smoking cigarettes in later years, my doctor told me that the most dangerous cigarette to me once I quit would be the first one, and that's how sin works. It only took one trip to a club and party with friends from the old life to become trapped again. I'm not proud of this failure in my life, but it is necessary to reveal so that the reader understands that darkness is ever so willing to draw you back in should you stand too close. Though my jail time had taught me better, I was no exception. There is a reason the Bible says, "Come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and I will receive you." 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 17. Chapter 19. Time to go. I'm not sure of the time frame, but it wasn't long before I realized I was standing far too close to my old life. I decided to leave the Dallas-Fort Worth market and separate myself from that old life completely. I chose to move back to Springfield, Missouri, and change my surroundings. And it wasn't enough to just move. I destroyed my contact list of friends and phone numbers and changed my cell phone number. I cut off all ties to that life so that it would be impossible to interact with anyone from that world again. For once in my life, I'd done what I should have done way back when I was in St. Louis. I'm not going to suggest that I was completely out of the woods at that point, but it was a start. My marriage at the time would soon fail, if that's any indicator. Even though I was back in church in Springfield, there would be several relationship failures and many mistakes before I began to heal properly. I was still an emotional train wreck and struggling spiritually at times. Chapter 20. Blessed in spite of myself. As hard as it was, I am very grateful for the education I received in the car business while in Dallas. In spite of my failures there, God began to bless me in that business while in Springfield, so much so that it wasn't long before I was approached to be in management. It took a few dealership moves to find a dealership that I was comfortable in, and God began to restore my reputation of honesty and hard work. I'd failed in many areas prior, but I was determined to avoid the wrong crowds and not allow myself to fall to dishonest behavior, which is so common in the car business. Being invited to management made my heart leap for joy. But when I learned it required a background check, my heart sank again. The thought of a background check scared me to death. Up to that point, I'd kept the information of my conviction to myself, but now I had to come clean if I was to move forward. I was surprised that when I revealed it to management, they didn't flinch. I knew that many salespeople had similar legal issues in their past, but had known none of them to be promoted into management. My first management position was to be in the finance department, working with the lenders, and when I received my license, it brought tears to my eyes. It had taken almost a month, and I had been on pins and needles the whole time, uncertain of the outcome. I had much to learn still, but I was beginning to trust the wisdom of God in my life and began to look back and see how all the pieces were beginning to fit. My skill set in the car business soon made me one of the most sought-after managers in the area. At one point, my numbers were ranked in the top 2% of the nation. After several years, I would end up in the Tulsa area, working for a Christian dealership owner where sales meetings began with prayer. It was in Tulsa that I began to put it all together, and it would be in Tulsa where my life would put me on a path that would bring enormous healing, both spiritually and emotionally. The time I spent in Tulsa was a very important time for me, as it began the beginning of significant changes in my life. I'm hesitant to discuss years at this point for fear of discouraging those who have reached this point of the book. However, I find it necessary so that the reader truly understands that I mean it when I say, there is a blessing in every situation if you are willing to endure it long enough for the blessing to be revealed. I'm not suggesting that everyone will have to endure the 17 years I had from my conviction to that point in Tulsa, though I will say that if your head is as hard as mine, you might. Spiritual growth and the blessing of financial success would come much easier than the emotional side of life. I just couldn't seem to get out of my own way in the latter. In hindsight, I believe it was my spiritual growth that made the biggest impact on my ability to be successful in business. In my humble opinion, there is a delicate balance between the spiritual, emotional, and physical needs of an individual, and any one of the three can have a substantial influence on the other at times. I've always been fortunate to have good health, and I was progressing spiritually at a steady pace, but emotionally, I had a long way to go. As I look back on my inability to conquer that aspect, it held me back many times. I seemed to be addicted to emotional chaos. I found the following quote from a recovery website called Recovery Direct that somewhat explains what I'm trying to say. It reads as follows. While the concept of being addicted to chaos and stress seems absurd, the condition is far more prevalent than you would expect. Emotional addictions can occur when people grow up in environments where they were exposed to consistent stress, chaotic events, and emotional abandonment. Overcoming my addiction to emotional chaos was the hardest area of my life to gain control of, and it wasn't until I spent many hours in counseling with a Christian psychologist from my church that I began to understand how to manage it back to health. He spent only one session diving into my past, unlike most psychologists who seem to want you to stay there. I began to understand how stuck I was in the past emotionally, and once I was able to identify the problem and understand that this issue was common and not just me, I began to heal. This is not meant to excuse any behavior in the past. Sometimes you just don't know what you don't know. Chapter 21. You're not going to believe this. I'd made the decision to be single for about a year in Tulsa, as I finally realized that I shouldn't be in a serious relationship. Something was very wrong with how I was approaching relationships, and at some point, I became determined to understand the problem. It wasn't long before God revealed my issue. My issue was that I knew what to look for in a person, but was settling for less than I should. I had the tendency to believe in potential instead of reality. By that I mean, I would accept less in someone's character with a hope that what God was doing in my life would inspire them to follow. I believe the term for this is missionary dating. You'd think that after all the relationship failures I'd had in the past, that I would have figured this out long ago, but if you haven't learned by now, my decision-making skills to this point had not been very good. They say you can't fix stupid. I'm grateful that God is not part of the they crowd. I'm still amazed that He never gave up on me. While I was single, God began speaking to my heart and helped me understand two things. One was that until I was content being alone, I would never be content being married. Believe it or not, even in marriage, one can feel lonely at times. Numerous things within marriage can create those feelings if not dealt with properly by both parties. The other was that, should it come time to date again, I should be looking for someone who is, and not someone who could be. I determined in my spirit that, should someone come into my life as a potential mate, they needed to have a spiritual understanding close to mine so that we can walk in agreement. That doesn't mean agreeing all the time. It means we are on the same road to spiritual growth. I also determined within my heart that they should be active in church and teaching at some level. In December of that year, I received an email from eHarmony offering a free trial to their site. It was much different than the dating sites of that era because it required you to take a very extensive personality and psychological test to be matched. It also eliminated those on the web who were hunters, could not get online and scroll through its members. Members would be selected for you, and you had the opportunity to connect through a very strict structure of predetermined, company-generated questions. If at any time you were not satisfied with an answer, you could decline, and that person would be blocked forever. You were not able to contact each other initially outside of those tin can questions and could not proceed until you'd both been through that process, and even then, it was very limited. I took a chance. I was curious. The first step was to review your matches, and each match came with a picture and some very basic information. If you had an interest, you would simply hit the interest button, which would notify the other party. If the other party responded, it would place you both in the tin can question area. If you successfully made it through several rounds of questions, the system would open up so you could ask questions in your own words. One of the first matches for me was a woman named Marta on January 4th of that next year. She stated that she had been on disability with something called fibromyalgia, that she hadn't dated for 7 years, and she was interested in teaching abstinence to teenage girls. My immediate, very loud verbal response was, and I quote, "Hell no. The last thing I need in my life is an unemployed prude." Sorry for the language, but I must be honest. I'd already had experience with women who did little more than leech off my income, and I was done with that. I shut down my computer in disappointment and had no interest in clicking the interest button at all. It was later that day, or the next day as I recall, that I got online to see if anyone had an interest in me, and was quite excited to see that someone had clicked the interest button. I opened their request and was stunned to learn that it was Martha, the very person I had no interest in but failed to block. I can't describe what was going on in my head, but for some odd reason I felt led to respond and at least get answers to a few tin can questions, if for no other reason than to be kind. We began answering those questions and quickly made it through that process where we could then speak more freely. I knew exactly how to get rid of her. I would tell her that I'm an ex-con, tell her the complete story of my arrest, and the fact that I'd been divorced multiple times. I was confident it would discourage any interest she had in me for good. It had been a tactic that had worked well over the last year and had been very effective at killing any interest in having a relationship with me in the past. Her response shocked me. She said it made her cry to know that I'd been through all that, and as far as she was concerned, it was of no consequence to her. She stated that when she read my email, God put the Bible verse in her heart that says, "It is finished." She's not stupid, though. She ran a background check on me to verify what I'd told her. The officer could not speak in specifics, but told her that if she were his daughter, he would not want her to be dating me based on my rap sheet. Well, that was unexpected. I wasn't quite ready for that response, and to be honest, it frightened me a bit. How crazy does someone have to be to walk past that information without a thought, while stating that God had given her peace about it? It threw me completely off balance. We began to exchange more emails and discussed several topics in detail, including how we each felt about Ephesians chapter 5. You know, the wives being in submission text. As I recall, she was the one who brought it up for discussion, which impressed me. I'd spent most of my life allowing women to dictate my life, and it was very refreshing to meet someone who was okay with being a godly woman. It was January 19th, just 2 weeks from when we were matched, when we would first speak on the phone. She'd included her phone number at the bottom of the email, and I initially missed it. I read the email again a few minutes later and realized the number was there, and it was an invitation to call. I picked up the phone and dialed the number. I don't know about you, but I normally expect someone to answer the phone with a simple hello. But what I got set me back a bit. Her very first words to me by phone were, "What took you so long?" She had no idea that I'd simply overlooked the number at the bottom of the email, and we laughed about it. As I recall, we were on the phone for hours that night, and over the next couple of weeks, we would exchange over 100,000 words by email. Through the calls and emails, I learned that she was active in church and had been leading a women's group for several years. I'd finally met someone who is, and not just could be. One problem immediately came to the forefront. She lived in Tampa, Florida, and I lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Despite that fact, we continued to get to know each other. Call us stupid, and many people did. But on January 20th, during our second phone call, I asked her to marry me, and she accepted. We discussed in great length when to get married and eventually settled on March 21st of that same year. We decided that it would be easier for me to move to Florida where she was, because I was much more accustomed to being uprooted. I spent the next several weeks selling everything I had and shipped boxes of necessary belongings I'd be taking with me. We met in person for the first time 3 days before the wedding. To say that her church was a bit concerned with how quickly this was happening would be an understatement. One of her friends gave us 6 months. However, Martha believed that God was in this and ignored the criticism. It was much easier for me to ignore them. I didn't have to see them every week. We originally planned a simple wedding with just a few witnesses, but when her best friend learned of our marriage, she was determined to make it a church wedding. Her best friend arranged for a small church she belonged to and put together a wedding and reception of some 40 guests along with a photographer. One of Martha's closest friends was a youth director at the time, and he agreed to conduct the ceremony. I, on the other hand, planned to sing at our wedding, cowboy hat and all. For several years, I'd been very active as a headliner in the country music world and had written a song that I wanted to sing at our wedding. There was a backstage area in the church where I changed and prepared for the wedding. There were a couple of the guests in attendance who even knew what I looked like, and it created quite a surprise in the end. My music started while I was still backstage, and I began singing from there while walking around the corner to stand in my position in front of the minister. It was hilarious. Many of the guests began taking photos as I walked up front, thinking I was just the entertainment. The song had an instrumental portion in the middle, and during the instrumental, Martha began walking down the aisle. We'd rehearsed the timing of it, and her walk down the aisle was perfect. Martha was absolutely beautiful. And the look on every face when they realized I was the groom was priceless. All is crazy if you must, but as of this writing, we will be celebrating our 13th anniversary in a couple of months. She's been the only woman who could put up with me, has been a godsend, and I love her dearly. Chapter 22. 3 Strong. Martha and I coined the phrase 3 Strong as a representation of our marriage. It was inspired by a Bible verse in Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verse 12, which reads, "And if one prevail against him, 2 shall withstand him, and a 3-fold cord is not easily broken." The 3 cords were to represent me, Martha, with Jesus in the middle. The original plan was for me to find work at a dealership, which seemed an easy task at the time, since I came with exceptional references. However, when I approached several dealerships, I just couldn't get peace about any of them, which was not in our plan. Martha had some money saved up, so it wasn't an immediate issue, yet. God would have other plans for us, and believe me, it would test us both as individuals and would test the marriage even more. How ironic it was that when we met, I was worried about an unemployed wife, only to discover myself as the unemployed husband. This would not have been an issue had it been just a few weeks, but weeks turned into months, and we learned quickly that we both had brought plenty of baggage into the marriage. Baggage that we didn't even know existed until we were married. If what I've written in this section was a commercial on how to get married, it would be followed by a very large printed disclaimer that reads, "Children, don't try this at home." At some point, we felt led to pursue the insurance business. Well, I felt led. God would have to give Martha a nudge to follow. After all, she had agreed to be an Ephesians chapter 5 wife. I cannot emphasize enough how important it was that both of us sought the face of God during this time, and that both of us were committed to the promises of God. We'd have never made it without His help. Life was not easy for Martha as she watched her savings dwindle, and when it came time to use said funds to pay my child support obligations, it would put an enormous strain on her. We were being tested on several fronts from a faith standpoint. She had to trust God that I was not a total idiot, and had to trust that I was listening to God's every word, which is not an easy thing to do. My tolerance for risk at the time was much greater than hers. We argued a lot. Those early days were by far the hardest I'd ever been through, and I know for a fact that it was not her path of choice either. Life was complicated even further once I applied for my insurance license. Again, I would be subjected to a background check. Only this time it was a federal background check accompanied by a detailed set of my fingerprints. It would take Florida 6 months to clear me for the state exam. The good news, however small, was that as soon as I passed the test, I was given my license on the spot. I say small because I made very little money first and struggled to find a company that made any difference. I could write a book on how many times I had to leave one company for another over the next few years. It made no sense to do so except that God led me to do so each time. Every opportunity I took taught me what I needed for the next one, and step by step, we moved forward. Sometimes we took a step up, and other times, it meant a step down. Some days the income was good, and other days we barely scraped by. We always knew that God was in every decision, and we were never late on any bills even at times when her savings had been depleted and we lived very frugally. In fact, one of our favorite things to do was to split an order of nachos on date night, even though it was all we could afford. Finally, I was able to land a position on the executive team of a major insurance company, which made life much easier. but it would be short-lived because the company made some major changes that led to yet another step back a couple of years later. It seemed like every turn we made was eventually met with resistance, and we all know where that resistance comes from. The evil one will never make it easy to serve the Lord, and we were no exception. Even though money was tight, God would lead me to open an insurance agency, and by this time, Martha was much more comfortable following by faith when God gave me direction. She'd seen how God had never let us down through the years, and how God provided the needed income when it was needed, even when it didn't arrive until the very last moment. It would take several years for the agency to earn any income of any substantial substance, and though God was leading me to continue to build it, He would provide yet another opportunity with a job that I could work in tandem, as we did. I was contacted by a local credit union that had seen my resume online and wanted to interview me for a role that would take advantage of my previous dealership management experience. They were looking for someone who could develop good relationships with dealers and help their members negotiate their auto purchases for them. But, and that's a big but, it would require that I have lending authority, which in turn required yet another background check and fingerprinting. In addition to the income they were offering, they would pay 100% of my health insurance and long-term disability, provide 2 weeks of paid vacation, which would soon become 3 weeks paid vacation, paid holidays, a pension, and would require very few weekend responsibilities. Need I remind you that my conviction of years past was for theft and defrauding a financial institution? It was a bit unnerving for a couple of weeks because the credit union put me in orientation before the results of the background check became available. By now, you'd think I'd be totally relaxed while going through this process, but this was very different. This was the very field I had been accused of defrauding those many years ago. I never saw the report, and they have never spoken about it, but I got the job. I would find out later just how God's favor works because I was not the only former dealership manager they had interviewed and were about to hire for the same role. The other candidate had interviewed 2 weeks prior, and the credit union was just about to hire him for the role when my resume came to their attention. Once I had interviewed, the credit union went back to the original candidate and offered him a different position in the same department and hired me for the position instead. I've had numerous conversations with the other candidate, and he's very grateful that it happened that way. The position they steered him to has been a better fit for him in his mind anyway. Chapter 23. Looking to the Future. I'm now 30 years removed from that fateful day at the Austin DMV, the arrest, and the conviction that followed. I'd love to tell you what my future holds, but I have no idea what God has intended for me in the future. I just know that if life were to end today, I've experienced a side of God that I wish everyone in seemingly impossible situations could. A former pastor of mine always said that life is about learning to navigate the curves. Race car drivers know that to gain traction in the curves, one must accelerate. Braking is not the answer to successfully taking a curve. My advice is that you point your life toward a loving God, turn it all over to Him, and accelerate. You may believe that God does not have the ability to forgive and restore you in your situation, but trust me, you can't mess up your life or run any further than I did. You can't be any more rebellious than I was. I've only touched on the parts of my life that can be discussed. There are other parts that I will never discuss with anyone, including my wife. Those events are between me and God alone, and as far as He is concerned, it is finished. I won't sugarcoat it. When you choose to follow the Savior and enter the path out of the darkness, there will be some circumstances you can outlive with time, and there will be others that have lifetime consequences. I'm going to say it again in case you were not listening before. There is a blessing in every difficult circumstance if you are willing to endure the hardship long enough. Turn everything over to the Savior and have the courage to step out by faith when He nudges you to do so. Throughout all the hardships, God would remind Martha and me many times of the truth found in Colossians chapter 1, verse 13, which, speaking of God the Father, says, hath delivered us from the power of darkness. It's very important that you reread this small portion of Scripture. It doesn't just say He's delivered us from the darkness. It says that He has delivered us from the very power of darkness. That means that when you learn to trust God at His word and are willing to humble yourself before Him, you cannot fail. Let me say that again. You cannot fail. The only thing you can do is quit, and that is a choice that is made by you. God never quits, and when you finally grasp the truth of that, you will realize, just as I have, you can. This has been When God Sends the Ride, learning that you can when mistakes say you can't. Written by Michael Baker and narrated by Jerry Dugan. Copyright 2022 by Michael Baker. All rights reserved. Thank you for listening.